We are inching ever closer to actually getting into the text of Revelation itself. This week is week number 4 in our study. And so far what I've been trying to do is trying to open up for you the biblical context into which the book of Revelation can be read, and to explain to you why it is that I take the particular view that I do at this point in my life. Now, last week we looked at Daniel chapter 9, and I put forward the thesis that what is prophesied there in that book is exactly what you see taking place in the book of Revelation. The angel revealed to Daniel that 70 sevens have been decreed for his people, 70 sets of 7. Some of your translation will say 70 weeks. And this is to come after they have finished their Babylonian captivity. And so we set about last week to try to understand what exactly that meant. Now, I hit you with a lot of information last week, and it was suggested to me, Barbara suggested at the end of class, it would have been great if we could have had a handout with some of that information on it. So if you look on your table here today, there should be 2 handouts, one that's double-sided and one that just has one side on it. And for the moment, I want you to look at the one that says 77s at the top. Okay. And this will give you a brief but fairly thorough explanation of the information that we went over last week. There are 77s, or 70 weeks, that are decreed for Daniel's people and for the city of Jerusalem after the 70 years that they spent in Babylonian captivity. And the 7 sevens is split up into 3 different categories. There is a first set of 7s that will take place during the ministry of Nehemiah as he and the Israelites labor to rebuild the city. That timeline begins in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8, with the decree that is given to Artaxerxes, which stands 7 times 7, of course, stands for a total of 49 years. Then there is a much longer set of 62 sevens, which if you 7 times 62, 434 years. And this basically represents a time period from the end of Nehemiah's ministry to the coming of Christ. At the end of this period of the 62 sevens, the prophecy says that the anointed one will be cut off and he will have nothing. He will be basically lose everything. He'll be put to death. And that eventually destruction is going to come to the city of Jerusalem. And of course we realize both of those things happened. But that leaves one set of 7 that is not yet accounted for. Obviously these are not just sequential sets of 7, because there's a pretty good gap between the death of Christ and the destruction of Jerusalem. So there's this one 7 left yet that has not happened. And Daniel prophesies that in this last 7, a ruler will come and make a covenant with Israel, but then he will break it halfway through. Halfway through 7 years, of course, would be 3.5 years. And we looked at, throughout Revelation last week, there is this repeated reference to 42 months, 1,260 days, a time, times, and half a time, all of which are different ways of saying 3.5 years. That's how this ties together with Daniel, okay? And what will the completion of these 77s bring about? 6 things, as you see there on your handout. It will finish Israel's transgression. It will put an end to the reign of sin. It will atone for wickedness. It will bring in everlasting righteousness. It will seal up vision and prophecy. And it will anoint the most holy place. Half of those things I suggested to you happened at the first coming of Christ, and the other half will be completed at the second coming. Okay? You can probably see that there's some information there also on the back side of that handout, and that has to do with the order of events that will take place in this final 7. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. Now, what that handout is not is a speculation about when it's going to happen. Okay, it is instead the order of events will be happen when it starts to take place. There's all sorts of speculation about when it might happen, and unfortunately a lot of people who take this view have wild theories. And I predict, I guarantee, that with the things that happened this weekend, those people are going to be coming out of the woodwork again. Okay, if you're in Daniel chapter 9, look at verse. Look at verse 26. The end of verse 26. The end will come like a flood. So eventually the end will come, and it will come like a flood. But war will continue to the end, and desolations have been decreed. He's talking about the city of Jerusalem here. Okay, war will continue to the end. But then this is this mysterious ruler, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will break that sacrifice. So war will continue until the end. So what do we know about Jerusalem until the end? It's going to be constantly a source of warfare. Now, if some world leader rises to prominence and makes peace with Israel among all the nations, and Israel sort of sees it as their Messiah sort of figure, beware. Okay, your eyes need to be open at that point. But don't get caught up with all these speculations of people who think, okay, Israel's at war again, so this is prophecies of the end. It may be, it may not be, but all I'm saying is to you, we don't really know. Okay. So before we get into the main question of our class here this morning, which is going to be the question of the rapture, there's one more thing that's important that I need to point out to you. And I'll be honest with you, this was the most shocking thing that I discovered whenever I came into this particular form of opinion. And it's the one thing that's taken me the longest to sort of have to sit with and get a grasp on, because it kind of countered some notions that I have always been taught or always assumed. And so it may strike you the same way here this morning as we talk about it. I've been telling you along the way that each of these views of interpretation of Revelation have the word millennial in it. Premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial. Well, there's a reason for this. It's because each view has a certain way of viewing Revelation chapter 20 and the promise of the 1,000-year reign of Christ and the release of Satan at that time. And people either have a symbolic view of that or a literal view of that. Now, I've been arguing for a literal view of it, which is a change from for much of my growing up years. But I need to show you something important that will ultimately kind of feed into this question of the rapture that we're going to take up a little bit later in the class. The other morning, Jay and I were having our weekly prayer time, and I asked him, I said, how you feeling about some of these things that I'm talking about here in the book of Revelation? Because I know he's been watching Richard Rogers' class, which takes a little bit of a different view than I do, and I don't know what your Mennonite background taught in regard to these things, but also along Church of Christ history, so I was kind of curious, how are these things settling with you? One of the things that he expressed was that I'm not quite sure what the purpose would be of a 1,000-year reign of Christ before entering into the new heavens and the new earth, where we're going to reign with God forever and ever and ever. What is the purpose of this 1,000-year reign before the eternal state? And I thought that's a very good question, and I want to try to speak to it here just a few minutes this morning. There are basically three reasons why a 1,000-year reign on the earth fits into God's purposes and the one story that the Bible, I think, is telling. Okay? The first reason has to do with Israel itself. I know Israel's fresh on our mind right now because of everything that's going on there. God has made promises to Israel in terms of land and in terms of spiritual blessing that he has not yet fulfilled. Okay? And I'm going to argue God does not make promises in vain. He doesn't make promises that seem to say one thing only to reinterpret them into another way and sort of fool everybody. He always keeps his word. That's how we know he's steadfast and reliable. And I'm going to argue that in the millennium, God will fulfill all the promises to Israel that he has not as of yet fulfilled. Believing Israel, not unbelieving Israel, they'll still be condemned, okay? But believing Israel. And the reason I say that is because we can make a whole class of this sometime, but if you start in Isaiah and you go all the way through the prophets to the end to Malachi, there are passage after passage about this time that is coming where Israel is greatly blessed, but that has not yet happened in history. Okay? And I'll give you an example here in just a few moments. Second, the reign over the millennium is the realm in which God will reward his people for faithfulness in this life. All saved people are going to come into the kingdom of God, but it is not true that we will all have the same reward. Now, I think it is true that everyone will be utterly happy according to their capacity, but it's also true, I think, not everyone has the same capacity. All of us are different beings, different things. And so, you have in mind, think about some of these parables where the parable ends with something like this. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a, what? Few things, but I'll put you in charge of many things. Well, where does that happen? I'm going to argue the millennial reign is the place where that happens. Finally, the purpose of the millennial reign is so that God's purposes will not be thwarted by Satan, and he will have a people, as he always intended, to reign over the earth. Satan will not win. He will not thwart God's purposes. It may have taken a detour, but God will have his way. Now, with those three purposes being stated, there are some things that we need to put together in our mind about this 1,000-year period, because we don't usually have a lot of teaching on this. Number one, all of God's saved people from the Old Testament period and the New Testament period will enter into the millennium in their resurrected and perfect bodies. Okay? At that point, you'll be beyond death. You'll be beyond sin. You will not have children anymore. Okay, that's what Jesus says about being like the angels in that particular way. Okay, you will enter into the millennium in your resurrected, perfected body. Number two, there will be a people who enter alive into the millennium who will not be in resurrected bodies. These are the people who are alive in that final tribulation period, who will then pass through the judgment of the sheep and the goats. Okay? The goats will be entered into the lake of fire, whereas the sheep will be told, enter into the kingdom that has been created for you. Number three, the state of the millennium will be a much better state than the current state of things. But for those who are not yet resurrected and in their perfect bodies, death will still be a factor. Sin will still be a factor. Now, it will be more rare because it will be a much more blessed time, but Revelation 20 teaches, if you're going to take a literal view, that Satan stirs up a rebellion at the end of that, and he's finally put down. Well, if you're going to take the literal view of that, the question is, who does Satan stir up a rebellion among? It can't be among those of us who have been resurrected and perfected. It has to be among others, okay? Now, the question you probably should be asking at this point is, okay, where's the biblical evidence that the earth will enter into a state that is much more blessed than the current one, but not yet perfect? Well, Revelation 20 is one of those texts, okay? But there are places scattered throughout the prophets where such a time is talked about. Let me show you one in specific. Turn in your Bibles or look here on the screen to Isaiah chapter 65. Isaiah 65 is a passage that speaks both about the judgment that is to come, that's the first 16 verses, but then the glorious time that the earth will enter into after it. And as I read this to you, it's likely that you will remember it, but as I read it slowly, you might pick out some details here that maybe had not jumped out to you until it's pointed out. See, I will create a new heavens and a new earth. That's God's ultimate plan. I will create a new heavens and a new earth. That's Revelation 21 and 22. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. But in the meantime, be glad and rejoice forever in what I will create. For I will create Jerusalem to be a delight, and its people a joy. Here's the promises to Israel that I was talking about. I will rejoice over Jerusalem, and I will take delight in my people, and the sound of weeping and crying will be heard in it no more. Now notice this, verse 20. Never again will there be in it an infant, a baby, who lives only a few days. No infant mortality, no SIDS, no miscarriages. Or an old man who doesn't live out all of his years. The one who dies at 100, he's just a kid, they'll say. The one who fails to reach 100 will be thought accursed. Now that's very different from our own time, isn't it? If someone makes it to 100, we're like, wow, okay, impressive. And here, in this time, he's saying, if they don't make it to 100, they'll thought, it's just a kid, you know. And if they don't make it to 100, they'll be considered accursed. They will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. I'll skip down to verse 24. Before they call, I will answer, and while they are still speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb will feed together, the lion will eat straw like the ox, the dust will be the serpent's food. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord. Okay, so beautiful picture presented here in Isaiah 65. A time is coming that's going to be incredibly better than it is now. There'll be harmony in life, harmony in nature. There will be peace with God, and the blessings of God will flow. And yet, death is still present. It's rare. The odd person who experiences it will be considered accursed, but it does still happen. And they still have children at this time. It is because there will be people who enter into the millennium in their natural state. They will be greatly blessed in their experience in that natural state. They will live long lives. Perhaps it will return to the long lives of the days before the flood, but it is not yet perfect. Now, for those of us who have lived our life and have been resurrected, we will be beyond death, beyond sin, beyond all that kind of stuff. We will be the servants of Christ ruling over the nations. But for those who come into the millennium through that final judgment, while things will be much better, it will not yet be perfect for them. That's why at the end of that period, Satan can stir up one last rebellion among those who are capable of being deceived. Now, all that was pretty hard for me to take in, okay? And it may be that it's pretty hard for you to take in this morning, because I never even heard it in my growing up years. I've had to sit with it a while, study with it a while, restudy it, pull it, look at it backwards, flip it over, treat it like a pancake, you know. I have the advantage that I can sit with these things for months and consider them and test them out, whereas I'm just hitting you with it all at once. And so don't be surprised if you're experiencing a little cognitive dissonance as we consider some of this. So as all things, just put it in there and think about it, and it will bear out as we study along. And if you're not convinced, that's okay too. But with that crucial bit of information in mind, we're now ready to look at the back of the handout that I gave you for this time period of the final 7 that is spoken about in Daniel and that I'm arguing is fulfilled in Revelation. This time period is kind of pieced together from places like Revelation, Matthew, Zechariah, Isaiah, 1 Thessalonians, and so on and so forth. So if you've got that handout, let's just kind of briefly go over it real quick. Here's a basic timeline of events from this final 7. Some say, and we're going to argue this question here in a little bit, some say that this final 7 begins with a removal or a rapture of the largely Gentile church, thus making a way for a re-emergent Israel in this final phase, the rapture being from 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 and 18. Now that's very disputed territory, and I'm going to give both sides of that here in just a little bit. So just let it hang there for a moment, and we'll talk about it then. Soon after that, a time of world peace will ensue for the first 3.5 years as this beast, as this Antichrist, the little horn, the prince who is to come, however you want to call him from Scripture, the man of lawlessness, rises to power and consolidates his power, thus making a treaty with the people of Israel. The Antichrist will make a covenant with Israel and promise to be their protector, but he will break that covenant halfway through. Halfway through that period, the Antichrist, having broken that covenant, the nations will then be in uproar, and large-scale war will erupt, following by plague, famine, starvation, all things that usually come as a result of widespread war. At this point, God will then begin to bring his final judgments upon the earth. He will send plagues upon the earth, much in the same way that he sent plagues upon the Egyptians when he rendered judgment on their behalf. And this wrath is represented in the book of Revelations by 3 sets of sevens. There'll be 7 seals, and then 7 trumpets, and then finally the 7 bowls of God's wrath, which will complete the wrath of God. I'm going to argue that those things do not necessarily come in sequential order, and we'll make that point as we go through there. During this final period, according to this scheme of interpretation, God will set apart 144,000 people from Israel to be witnesses in the earth. They will preach the gospel, and they will have a large harvest, that great multitude of people from every tribe, tongue, and language in Revelation chapter 7. 2 witnesses will also be raised up during this time, which will also testify against the wickedness of the nations and will preach the gospel. The identity of these 2 witnesses is not known. It's not stated in Scripture. There's a lot of speculation that these final 2 witnesses will be Elijah and Moses, representing the prophets and the law, but there's no way to know whether that's correct or not. They will be murdered and will lie dead in the streets for 3.5 days, but then will be resurrected to finish their preaching of the gospel. As war and devastation continues through God's plagues, God will draw the nations into a large battle near Jerusalem. This is the battle in the plain of Megiddo, Armageddon. That's where we get that concept from. At that time, final judgment will be rendered upon Babylon, the world system, and God will bring his final wrath. Great destruction will happen to the city of Jerusalem as all this takes place, and 2/3 of all the Jews will be killed. The final third will escape, and they will turn to Christ at his appearing, from Zechariah 14. Christ will come, accompanied by his saints. Christ will destroy the beast, and the elect of God, both the Jews and the Gentiles, will be gathered by the angels and brought to safety. The ungodly will be condemned into judgment. Among those who are still alive at this judgment, they will face the judgment of the sheep and the goats. The wicked will be cast into hell, while the righteous will enter into the millennium in their natural state. Okay. Christ will institute a 1,000-year kingdom over the earth, where he will reign with all of his resurrected saints, both from the Old Testament and the church age, and they will reign over those who come into the millennium alive in their natural bodies, and Satan is bound during this time. Satan will be released at the end of that millennium, causing a rebellion among those who are still in their natural bodies, although he will be quickly defeated. And then the new heavens and the new earth arrive, along with the new Jerusalem, as God's people enter into the eternal state. Okay, so that is kind of just a quick 30,000-foot view of what's more or less taught in Revelation and corresponding passages, if you take a literal view of these events happening. With the rest of our time here this morning, which I've got about 10 minutes, I think, I want to consider with you this question of the rapture. Many of you may know this is one of the most hotly debated topics in biblical studies, especially in end-time studies, and it's worthy of us here this morning taking a few minutes to understand what it is and why it is such a hot-button issue. First of all, you'll not find the word rapture in the Bible. Okay, rapture comes from a Latin word. The Greek equivalent would be a catching up. Okay, and that comes out of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, where it talks about those will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So there is no question in biblical studies that there will be a catching up. There will be a rapture of some sort. The question is, when will it happen? Will it happen at the beginning of this final 7? Will it happen in the middle of this final 7 when the Antichrist breaks his treaty? Or will it happen at the very end when all Christ's saints will be caught up with him when he returns to the earth? By the way, for those who take a literal and a premillennial view, not everyone believes in a rapture. pre-tribulation rapture. All the earliest, when we went through the history of the church and I talked about premillennialism was the earliest view in the church, there's no evidence from any of that early writing that they had any concept of a rapture coming before that. So that's something to think about. But to begin with, we needed a little history on this idea. The view that there would be a rapture of the church before this final tribulation period begins is a fairly recent view. And by recent, I mean it developed in the middle 1800s, okay, by a man by the name of John Nelson Darby. Isn't he handsome? Just a handsome fellow there. Darby was a part of the Brethren movement in England. It was a separatist movement, a congregationalist, very conservative movement. And he was the first to put together the idea that the church will be raptured before this final 7 of Daniel takes place, and that the church in its present form will not be around to experience the wrath of God as it is poured out on the earth. Now, even though he was the first one to develop this, it's not true that he just kind of pulled this out of the air. He was looking very painstakingly at all the various scriptures about the return of Christ, and he was trying to put them together in a way that would systematize them, which led him to believe that there has to be a rapture to take the church out, the church of the Gentiles out, before the end comes. Otherwise, he says, you can't have all the right people in all the right places in all the right times for this literal view. That's especially true in regard to the millennium. Now, his view was very popular in England for a short period of time, but where it really found its most enthusiastic support was here in the United States. It was brought into the United States through the Scofield Study Bible. I've told you all about that before. And it became the dominant view of the 20th century in evangelical circles. It especially became the dominant view when Israel re-entered into the promised land, because people began to think, oh, maybe this is signs that the end is about to come. There have been a lot of sensational people who have believed this view. Some of y'all remember Hal Lindsey and his 88 reasons to believe that the return of Christ is coming in 1988. Do y'all remember that? The reason he said 88 is because Israel was reinstituted in 1948, and he thought it was going to happen within that generation, and so 40 years he thought was a generation, and that's, anyways, a lot to that. But there are two schools that primarily advocated this view in the United States. One is Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, of course. Many of y'all have heard of Chuck Swindoll, who's the preacher on the radio, David Jeremiah, Tony Evans, Charles Stanley. Those are all Dallas Theological Seminary guys. Chuck Swindoll was the president of it for a number of years. And then the other seminary that really advocates this view in the United States is the Master's Seminary, which is John MacArthur's church out in California. Now, I will tell you, as we get into this question, I am not going to take an absolute position on this question. Of all the things that I have studied, it's the thing that I'm least sure about. I do have my opinions about it, and that will probably bear out as we go along, but I think there are good reasons to discount this view and also good reasons to consider it. And so with our last few minutes here this morning, I want to give you some of that. So, when it comes to reasons to disbelieve in a rapture before the final 7, the strongest reason is its very late appearance in Christian history. My general position, and I've shared this with you before, is anytime you have somebody in Christian history who thinks they've come up with something new that all of Christian history hasn't seen before, usually you want to be pretty suspicious about that sort of thing. I was trying to press that point with my Jehovah's Witness friends that Oli and I have been studying with. This last Monday night, we were talking about things, and I asked him, I was like, so what makes you, I said, Jehovah's Witnesses have only been around a little over 130 years. What makes you think that you've suddenly discovered the truth that all the rest of Christian history has somehow missed? And they have their reasons, of course, and the light gets brighter and so on and so forth. But I really wanted to try to press that with them that, it should be suspicious. I think the same thing is true with a lot of the LGBTQ issues that have come up. There are a lot of interpretations now, alternative interpretations of Leviticus 18 and 20 and Romans chapter 1 that suddenly people are trying to put forward. And I'm thinking, okay, we've got to be suspicious of that. If we think we've suddenly found something that was true that the whole rest of Christian history has not discovered. So I'm going to argue the same thing's true in regard to the view of the rapture. The early church was premillennial in its belief. They did believe in a literal 1,000-year period of Christ, but there's very little, if any, evidence in the writings of the church father that they spoke anything about this rapture happening before the tribulation period. Okay. The second piece of evidence in regard to there not being a pre-tribulation rapture is that there is no pattern in history of God removing his people when he sends his judgments. Now, there is a pattern of God protecting his people when he sends his judgments, but not so much of him removing them. For example, the judgments that came upon Egypt. Israel was still there, weren't they, when all those plagues came upon the Egyptian. Now, the Israelites were protected. The plagues did not come upon them, but they were still there. How about Noah? Noah and his family were saved from the wrath of God, but they were still here, weren't they, as the wrath was poured out. They were just saved and protected from it. I have a very good friend down in Texas who was a part of the church that I preached for down there, and he and I like to talk about these things every once in a while, and he'll often make this point to me. We've been kind of batting around the idea of the rapture lately as I've been thinking through these things, and he makes the point there is no precedence in history of God removing his people when the wrath is poured out. He may protect them, but he does not remove them. And I think there's something important to think about that, because as you think about the future, you wouldn't want to have this false assurance that we're going to escape everything when in fact we may have to go through it, right? You wouldn't want to have this idea that well, everything's going to be okay because I won't be a part of it, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in the middle of it, okay? So better to be prepared for the worst, hope for the best, right? And that's kind of my philosophy when it comes to this. Now, I do think, in regard to this point, there is something that can be overlooked. For those who do believe in a rapture before this final 7-year period, it's not true that God is just removing all of his people. There is a purpose, possibly, for removing the church as it is currently constituted. Remember, we live in the time of the Gentiles, and we have a largely Gentile church. And in the more literal scheme of things, it is Israel that reemerges in these final days as the great witnesses of Christ and the lead evangelists of the world, which will lead to this final harvest. So it would not actually be true that all of God's people are removed from the tribulation period. It's just that there's a shift in demographics, if you will, from a largely Gentile church to a largely Jewish church that can reemerge to evangelize the nations. Now, does that discount everything we've said right here? I'm not sure, but it is something to at least keep in mind. So let's close this morning. Look at the last handout that you have here. I'm going to give you the flip side of the evidence now. Evidence for a pre-tribulation rapture, of why it would make sense that there does have to be one. The very first one, I think, is the strongest piece of evidence. And that is, you have to account for all the different kind of people that will be in the millennium. Those who are resurrected and reigning with Christ, those who are still in their natural bodies but yet are susceptible to the deception of Satan at the end of that period. Well, how do you get all those people there? The only way you can really, because if the return of Christ comes and all of Christ's saints are raptured up at the end, well, then who enters into the millennium in the natural state? And the answer is nobody would be. Everybody would be perfected. So in this view, it seems like you have to, and this is where Darby was picking up on the things, you have to have a rapture that separates that out. Otherwise, you can't have all the people in all the places where they need to be. Okay. Number 3 there on the sheet. At the rapture, Christ comes in the air and returns to heaven with his people, while at the final event of the second coming, Christ comes to the earth to dwell and to reign. At the rapture, in that view, Christ gathers his own. He's the one that does the gathering, while at the final event of the second coming, it is the angels who gather the elect from across the earth. At the rapture, Christ comes to reward. That's John 14. I've come to take you to a place that I've prepared for you. While at the final event of the second coming, and forgive my typos there, final event of the second coming, Christ comes to judge, not to reward. At the rapture, resurrection is prominent, 1 Thessalonians 4, while at the final event of the second coming, there is no resurrection mentioned, only judgment and entering into one kingdom or the other. At the rapture, believers depart from the earth, while at the final event of the second coming, the unbelievers are the ones who are taken away. Think about all those parables where it says that the unbelievers will be swept away rather than the believers. At the rapture, it will be the unbelievers who remain on the earth, which is kind of implied. But at the final event of the second coming, believers will be the ones who will be left on the earth in their natural state. At the rapture, there's no mention of Christ establishing his kingdom, while at the final event of the second coming, Christ does establish his kingdom on the earth. And then finally, at the rapture, believers will receive their glorified bodies, while at the final event of the second coming, no one is mentioned as receiving their glorified bodies. So that gives you a little evidence on both sides. And like I said, I'm a little suspicious of it because of its recent view in history, but I also think there is a strong case for it when you consider just the biblical evidence itself. And so as we continue in through Revelation, I'll not take a dogmatic position on that. Next week, we'll actually start the text itself, and I'm looking forward to that, and we'll begin to plow our way through pretty quickly through the book of Revelation. Let me tell you, if you're more interested in a more in-depth verse-by-verse study, I've talked about John MacArthur in the Master's Seminary. He just started this last Sunday at his church a verse-by-verse study of Revelation. He has a podcast, the Grace to You podcast. It's the pulpit version, not the radio version. And I think from what he indicated, he's going to plan on he's preached through it before, he's going to do it again. Now, he goes very slow, and he's like 84 years old. So whether he makes it to the end of Revelation before, that's anybody's question. But if you're interested in a more verse-by-verse that's going to take the same basic view that I take, his would be a good one to listen to, and that'll be coming out week by week. It'll be a good supplement to this class. So if you're interested in it, I recommend it to you. So thank you all. Appreciate it.